November 2014, an important decision awaits us all people in Scotland. Between now and then, politicians will try to convince you that independence will either be beneficial or extremely dangerous for all of us. In fact, they have already started. We felt it was important that the average person also has a voice in the debate. Today, we intend to give that voice to a random selection of everyday people. We will be asking for their thoughts and feelings on what will be probably the most important political decision of their life. The people here today have no affiliation with any particular political parties at present. They are here only to discuss the question, should Scotland be an independent country? We have here a selection of people from those undecided to those actively promoting a yes or a no vote. Amongst them, there are two passionate people who wish to share their views on why they're voting the way they intend to on the day of the referendum. Speaking in favour of a yes vote, we have Rory Monroe, and trying to convince Rory that that would be the wrong thing to vote, we have Robert Graham, who will be speaking about why we should vote no. We also have a panel of people willing to engage and contribute to the debate. But now, enough of me talking. Let's see what they have to say, and we will start first of all with their opening statements.
My name is Robert Graham, and I was born in Glasgow in February 1946, which for any of the non-mathematicians amongst you means I'm now 68 years old. For any of the historians amongst you, it means that shortly after the announcement of my birth, Japan surrendered in the Second World War because they suddenly realised what they would be up against. At least that's my view of the situation, which others don't have to accept. During my life, I have actually voted for Labour, Conservative, SNP and Lib Dem for various reasons, so I don't have any strong affiliation to any one party. When I knew that there was going to be a referendum, I realised, as I think everyone did, that we were going to be bombarded with facts and forecasts and statistics and pretend facts and fantasies. And during my working life, I was in the publishing world, the petroleum world, and the financial services world. And in all of them, you are bombarded with facts, fantasies, forecasts, etc. And I decided that it would be important to try to simplify this question down to basically two questions, which would determine for me which was the right way to vote. The first question is, what problem of modern Scotland could we credibly believe would be solved or improved with separation? And the second question is, what problems that Scotland does not currently have might we be inviting by separating from the United Kingdom? Now, I've read as much as I can stand reading on the subject, and I've heard as many debates as any human being should be asked to put up with. And I have to say that I'm still in the position that I have not heard a credible reason that's not based on optimistic assumptions to believe that any of Scotland's problems, some of which are quite serious, would be helped by separation. Clearly, if certain forecasts about the economy worked and if certain political views were taken, they might be. As to the second question, what problems are we inviting? I think there's a very large number of them. The major one, to my mind, is the currency question, which sadly is being brushed aside, because it's not a simple question. The only reason I feel at all competent to comment on it is that in my last business, which was a financial services business, we had to spend quite a lot of time at seminars discussing currency unions, mostly with reference to the euro. And the consequences of getting the currency wrong can be very serious indeed. I think the Eurozone has demonstrated to us that, as Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, stated, currency union can work as long as you have fiscal and budgetary harmony. But if you have fiscal and budgetary harmony, you actually don't have independence at all. So, those are my points. As an opener, I have other reasons which we may come round to. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Robert.
So there are many things for all of us to consider when it comes to the question, should Scotland be an independent country? It's not an easy choice for any of us, or it shouldn't be. I don't believe you should go, I'm Scottish, therefore I'm voting yes, or I feel passionately British, therefore I'm staying within the Union. There are many, many things to consider, and one of those things is that it's not a vote for change versus the status quo. It's a vote for change administered by Westminster, or change administered by Holyrood. There are a few key questions that come to my mind when thinking about some of the answers to these, and one of which is, can Scotland as an independent country afford it? Well, over the past 30 years, our tax input into the UK economy has been higher by between 0.2 and 0.8% than the rest of the UK. So this shows that we can afford it. We put in more than we get back. In fact, the Financial Times said that an independent Scotland could expect to start with healthier finances than the rest of the UK. So if it can start with healthier finances than the rest of the UK, then surely you could assume that it can continue those finances in a healthy manner. Secondly, would it be more democratic? I'm a true believer in democracy. I believe that proportional representation is the most democratic way to vote in governments. And I believe that Westminster is not a democratic system. At the moment, the Scottish Government is voted in by the additional member system, part PR, part first past the post. It's already a more democratic, fairer way of doing the vote. So I believe that if this continued, yes, it would be a more democratic nation. Would politicians be more accountable? This is also important to myself. As we can see with Westminster and the House of Lords, unelected House of Lords may I add, people can go to jail, come back out and continue influencing policy, legislation for the country. I don't believe this is right. And I believe that as a smaller nation, that each one of us would have more influence on the goings on in Holyrood than we currently have at present as 8.4% of the United Kingdom. Another point I wish to make is, will it be fairer and more prosperous? That's another question, that comes to mind. The simple answer to that one is we don't know. Inequality has grown in the UK, we do know that, over the last 20 years at a faster rate than most other developed countries. Where are the levers that Westminster are introducing to reverse this? Could Scotland reverse this process and become a more equal country as an independent nation? I believe so, but it would take every one of us to carefully look at what parties are offering, and then, as a democratic election, choose which party we believe we should follow. As a last sort of point, can we do it? Well, if we can afford it, and we have a more democratic system of electing our governments, and the governments we elect are more responsible to the citizens because it's a smaller country, more tight-knit, they will have to listen more. So I believe, yes, they could do it, but it depends on what we all vote after. As I say, it's about change with a yes vote or change with a no vote. I believe that change with a yes vote has much more opportunity than change with a no vote. Obviously there are risks involved in independence. I wouldn't refute that point at all, and something which I believe that the major parties are trying to refute. The SNP, for example, would probably have us believe that we'd all be richer to the tune of £1,000. The rest of the UK parties, however, believe that it would be something around £1,400. I choose not to believe either of these, and I've got a little quote here from an American author. "It's hard to get somebody to understand something when their salary depends on it." And I believe this is what we should all think about when thinking what the MPs, MSPs are putting forward in their arguments for independence. Finally, I'd like to say that I believe a vote for yes is a selfless vote. I don't believe that many of the generations alive today will live to see the prosperity. Yes, there may be uncertainty initially, and therefore investors might not have confidence in the country, so pensions may be hit initially, but I believe that long term, an independent, smaller country such as Scotland could have the potential to be fairer, more prosperous, and better to the citizens that live within the country.
Thank you very much for that.
One important driver for me comes from my being very old, which is why I mentioned my date of birth. I was born just at the end of the Second World War in Glasgow, which at that time was literally a bombed out city. My parents lived in Clydebank, which, as you may know, is a little town, effectively a suburb of Glasgow, which is the centre of the shipbuilding industry, which was part of what made Glasgow in the 19th century probably the second or third richest city in the world. And the Germans targeted it, and they did immense damage. So the Clydeside I grew up in was damaged, traumatised. It was very common to see people walking around who had been severely injured in the war. There was a lot of malnutrition, and it was a very violent city. When we got into the 60s, when I was a teenager, I actually tried to emigrate to Australia because I thought Britain, not just Scotland, Britain had no hope. We were known as the sick man of Europe. We had descended from being the richest country in the world at the beginning of the century to being a country which in 1972, its gross domestic product was half that of West Germany. That was West Germany, not the united country we have now. And its GDP was only 2/3 of that of France. I saw no hope, and since then I have been amazed at the recovery. I was in Glasgow. I go to Glasgow quite often, but I was there particularly late last summer with my daughter and a friend. We were going to an exhibition of paintings by my nephew in Merchant City. And we were going to parts of Glasgow I would not have dared to go into at night when I was 18 or 19. And what I saw was an area that was full of cafes, restaurants, there was live music. I saw elderly couples out walking hand in hand. I saw young women walking quite unconcerned at 10:30 at night. And the improvement in Glasgow has been immense. And in the early part of the century, the GDP of the United Kingdom overtook France. It's actually slightly fallen behind again because of the banking crisis, but is now growing faster than France. And it is now 2/3 of the GDP of the United German economy, which roughly equates to the population. The United Kingdom, although it benefited much less from the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, has grown faster than its European counterparts, and that has enormously benefited Scotland. Glasgow particularly still has some very serious problems of housing, and its crime rate is still twice that of London. But that is a growth rate not matched by any other country in Europe, as far as I'm aware. And I feel it would be unwise to sacrifice that to what we all have to acknowledge is the unknown. Although I fully agree with Rory's point that even doing nothing is a risk and is unknown, because the future always is. Let me just say one thing and then I'll silence myself for a while. Shortly before I sold the small business I had, one of my oldest clients came to see me, and he had run a couple of major businesses. He had run the Alliance Trust in Dundee. And he said to me, "Robert, a very good principle for surviving in business is to realise that all forecasts on all subjects are always wrong." That's not totally true, but there's a huge amount of truth in it. There are statisticians telling us what will happen in the future. They don't know. There are possibilities and probabilities. Thank you.
So you spoke about the GDP, the gross domestic product. But really what I want to focus on is, what does the gross domestic product do for the people of the country? And also you're talking about long-term growth, and really it's the short term which gives an indicator of how well a country is doing. So since the financial crash, for example, the UK has taken longer to recover from that than smaller countries such as Iceland and Ireland, who legislated against potentially risky banking structures. Now personally I think that smaller countries, in fact I don't need to think that, when you look at the top 10 countries in the OECD rankings, they are small countries with between 4 and 9 million people in their population.
By GDP by head?
Per capita, yeah. And I believe that per capita is a better indicator than total GDP. Take a country like Brazil, for example. Its economy is, its GDP is similar to that of the UK now, I believe, yet because of the larger population, there is far more inequality and far more areas of poverty, extreme poverty in Brazil, because when you look at it like that, GDP per capita really is a more important way of looking at it, I believe in it. So when you look at the GDP of Scotland, it's higher than that of the rest of the UK. Will that continue to be the point? I think you make a fair point that we don't know whether that will continue to be the point. What I do think, however, is that oil as a solid asset rather than a financial services industry, which the UK based its economy on, or had it as a backer, financial services accounted for about 12 to 15% of GDP in the rest of the UK. That is roughly equivalent to what oil would provide for Scotland in terms of the tax take, as we don't own the oil, as we all know by now. So really what I'm trying to say is, surely having a smaller economy backed by a physical asset which minimum has 50 years left, surely that would be a better path to take than staying within a union where policies are made to favour London and the South East. When you look at wealth inequality, it's far higher in even the north of England and Scotland and Wales than it is in London and the South East. I ask myself, why is that? Why isn't wealth spread more effectively? And coming back to the principle of democracy, a lot of people would argue that Scotland's political philosophy as a nation is very similar to the UK as a whole. It's not. 3 times more people down south voted for the anti-European party, UKIP. 10% in Scotland. Unfortunately, that means we got one UKIP MEP up here. Whether you agree with that, I don't know.
I'm no strong supporter of UKIP.
No, just getting that one in there. So I believe that it would be fairer to vote parties or allow our political philosophy as a nation to prosper rather than be shut down by governments that we don't elect. For me, that is a strong argument.
I agree that GDP per head is much more important than overall GDP. And I'm aware of the projections that the GDP, well, in fact, not just projections, I'm aware of the calculations that the GDP per head in Scotland is greater than in the UK as a whole. I'm not sure that that means a great deal, because within the UK as a whole, you do have some very depressed areas, particularly the north of England and Wales. And the fact that the South East being prosperous, that will be true whether Scotland separates or not. London is a huge magnet for some quite objective reasons, like it's very well placed in time zones for people to do business with the East and the West. I think an important thing to take on board is that the GDP of Scotland after separation from the UK could be very different from a GDP before separation. For example, we're talking about financial services. Financial services are a very large part of the Scottish economy. And one of the largest operators in it is Standard Life. Now, if we come out to the UK, Standard Life will have no choice but to move its headquarters to England. That is simply a European requirement that any insurance company must have its head office in the country which has its largest market. Now, that takes away a very large employer from Scotland. Others may follow. It's quite likely that the Royal Bank of Scotland and HBOS will also move south. Whether they are a loss, of course, is another argument one could have. And of course, oil is one of the big talking points of the whole subject. I used to be in the oil industry, not for very long, for 3.5 years. And I remember being in meetings where we were told that oil would run out in the world by 1991, and that the price of oil would rise dramatically towards 1991, so that the companies which had large amounts of oil would become fabulously rich. And of course, we are completely awash with oil in the world. The fact that we can have adequate supplies whilst there is huge unrest in some of the major producers like Iraq and Nigeria and Venezuela, if they ever manage to get themselves sorted out, then we'll be even more awash with oil. I feel you can't make too many assumptions about oil, because in 1 year, as you probably know, 2008, the oil price varied from just under $150 per barrel down to under $50 per barrel. So if you had made your calculations on 150, which you probably would not have done, you'd probably have gone for a midpoint, then you'd have been quite alarmed when it got down below 50. It would be a large part of the Scottish economy, and the other major worry, I would suggest, is that there's a very strong Shetland independence movement, which the SNP has had to recognise. Shetland, Orkney and the Hebrides do not want to be governed from Holyrood. They have voted a long time ago, 35 years ago, there was a referendum where they voted 9-1 to be governed from Westminster rather than Edinburgh. Now, a lot could have changed in that time, I know, but 67% of the oil assets are estimated to be in Shetland and Orkney waters, so that could be quite damaging.
Going by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the maritime border between Shetland and Orkney wouldn't extend as far out into the North Sea due to this relative size as Scotland. And I believe that since 35 years ago, I cannot see Shetland and Orkney voting the same way. Trying to remember what
they want a referendum the week after our September one, and I mean, I honestly don't know how likely it is they would move off. Some of them had said they would rather be linked to Norway. That seems not very likely, but they certainly don't like the idea of being tied to Edinburgh, and that's quite a long-standing. Well, that's based on anything rational or not, I don't know.
I wouldn't believe it would be. I mean, again, it's the SNP's plans are the only plans that we can look to when it comes to what an independent Scotland would look like, well, and the Greens. And they believe in localism, in devolving more powers to local councils, more funding to local councils. In the UK, you just have to take a visit to the islands of Scotland and see how underdeveloped they are. The roads are terrible. The public services aren't very good. The money flows out but doesn't flow back. And the SNP, again, it's their plan to allow some of the money that flows out to flow back to them, to strengthen the powers of local councils, to increase funding to local councils, to do with it as they see fit. Now this brings the issue of whether they say, well, actually we've got lots of money, we're going to go.
I mean, I think it's a challenge that the SNP are aware of, and certainly would be well advised, obviously, to be as well liked in the islands as they can be. But I think it is a very serious issue, which I've not seen discussed very much. But I think it is a serious one. I'm not pretending that oil is the only asset that an independent Scotland would have, not by any means of whisky, of course, which I think is not under threat, except when the Japanese build a village called Scotland and produce whisky from Scotland. We'll stop them doing that, unfortunately. And during my lifetime, the economy of Scotland has changed radically because it was very heavily based on shipbuilding, steel production, whisky, in the early 1950s, and they were dying. And the Scottish economy began to recover strongly. I know Scots will be very surprised to hear this, began to recover strongly in the early 1980s, largely as a result of some of the policies of the Thatcher government. And the Gaelic language actually got huge impetus from the Thatcher government. But things like the electronics industry in Fife, avionics, and financial services benefited immensely at that time. So the economy has broadened out, but oil is still a larger part than I would like to see of it. And one of the principles of investment, which is what I was doing for the last 20 years of my working life, is don't put too many eggs in any one basket, have it as broadly based as possible. And one of my major worries about a separate Scotland is that oil would be just too large a part of our economy. It's quite important to the UK economy, but it's not. It's certainly not make or break, because the UK economy is a very broadly based one.
I can't see why that would worry you so much, given that, well, the UK was advised to set up a future generations oil fund. I'm sure you know that, Macron 76, part 2, but did not do so. It failed to do so. Had it done so, we could have been potentially as rich as Norway is, the only country in the Western world to not have any national debt. Scotland, or the SNP's plans are to set up a fund. Now that offsets the potential for volatility within that market, because money set aside can then offset future losses. And what we can say is, well, one thing that's touted by the No campaign was that £4.4 billion last year was how much the oil revenues taxes fell by. That was because 13.7 billion was invested, which within 5 to 10 years we're going to see the benefits of that investment through taxation. Other things like a new oil field coming online in 2017, which will produce 100 million barrels. So it is a volatile asset, but if managed well, it can ensure that your country is a very prosperous nation in terms of its GDP and its tax take. Going back to what you said about Standard Life and RBS and potentially many others, that's purely down to EU law that they would have to move their headquarters. That would result in some job losses, but it would be disingenuous to suggest that they would take their businesses completely out of Scotland and not continue to operate in some way.
No, I agreed that there would be some kind of presence, but it would be much smaller.
Again, this is an unknown, we can't say, but it would be much smaller. Maybe you could swing that in a positive way. The financial services, which are a much more volatile industry, they cause the world economic system to crash. Do we want them to play a bigger part of our economy than something like oil, which is a physical asset? Yes, the value can go down, but a physical asset will never crash completely until it's exhausted. And most industry experts agree that we've got at least 50 years left. And as you mentioned earlier, the oil industry is very good at undervaluing and estimating how much is left, because that in effect helps make the price remain more level. So we have at least 50 years left of this physical asset, which we can put money aside every year to a future generations fund to alleviate when volatility does get introduced into that industry. Yet financial services are a far more risky thing to pin your economy on. So if they are smaller and do play a smaller presence, yes, jobs will be lost, but those jobs will be created elsewhere, or could potentially be created elsewhere. It's all down to the policies that any government we vote in would make. I'm sure you've heard of the Luddite fallacy, that jobs within machinery...
I haven't heard of the Luddite fallacy.
Oh, the Luddite fallacy, okay. The Luddite fallacy.
I know what Luddites were.
Yeah, the movement. When...
to destroy arkwright, spinning jenny, etc.
Yeah. So where jobs are lost, where technology replaces jobs generally replace those.
Oh yeah, I agree with that.
So jobs may be lost within financial services, but it's dependent on the policies. It is an unknown. So I guess I'll talk about Westminster for a bit. If we look at the proposals, from all the Westminster parties, the proposals include income tax. They don't include corporation tax, VAT by EU law. So they're saying that instead of Scotland getting a block grant, that they can raise their own money through income taxes. Sounds great in principle, but that could actually damage the amount that Scotland gets in spending. At the moment, last year I believe it was 9.9% we put into Westminster, 9.5% back. And of the 0.4% that does not come back, Westminster spends on our behalf on things like defence and embassies around the world. So that block grant is working for a devolved government. Take that away and introduce income tax, but give us no money from North Sea oil tax revenues, and our budget then falls by a further 4.4 billion estimated.
I mean,
that would affect future public spending. So,
sorry.
The ultimate outcome of that, if you analyse what could potentially happen. So we get less in terms of the tax take, and we have our own powers to set our own tax rates. So there's two ways that could possibly go. Scotland increases taxes, Holyrood, increases income tax over and above what it is in England, or they slash public spending. Now that's the worst case scenario under independence, but we would have under independence the economic levers to increase production and increase investment in our economy. And also long term, Scotland has an ageing population. as does the rest of the UK. But at the moment, I'm sure you're aware that Westminster's policies seem to be regressing, going against immigration. Scotland would need that if it was to afford
Sorry, how
pensions.
are Westminster's policies going against immigration? They are trying to limit the huge immigration we get,
Yeah,
but I think they're still welcoming a lot of immigration.
still welcoming a lot of immigration, but for example, one thing, they're giving student visas but not work visas post that. They've taken away that. That surely is a good thing, to train someone up and then allow them to benefit the economy once they've been trained up here.
Can I take some of these
Sure, sorry.
points?
Yeah.
So, quite a lot of points there. I may or may not pick up all of them. And one thing, of course, in comparisons with Norway does have a lot more oil than we have, and they have certainly managed it extremely well. There's a wide range of forecasts on what effect Scotland's oil will have on the economy. There's certainly quite a lot of forecasts that are, bearing in mind what I said before about forecasts, as credible as other forecasts, that even the SNP's projections are too optimistic, and that any reasonable projection could not possibly pay for some of the commitments that they have made. These are projections, these are forecasts. There is really no way for us to be certain you believe who you want to believe on that kind of subject. As far as what Westminster is going to do, I know that the UK parties are bringing out their suggestions tomorrow of what further powers they intend to devolve to Scotland. So I don't actually know what they are yet, except the tax reduced powers.
Quite a lot of the points in what they're going to release tomorrow have already been released.
But they're certainly going to allow Edinburgh tax raising powers. I'm not aware, that you can correct me this if I'm wrong, I'm not aware that they are going to penalise Scotland through any other kind of taxation. I think our corporation tax rate will still be the same as the UK corporation tax rate.
The point I'm trying to make is that without power over the corporation tax rate, if you increase income taxes within Scotland within the Union, you're then creating a negative competitive system with the rest of the UK. But why would anyone want to move to Scotland to work in Scotland if taxes were higher, income taxes were higher?
But that would be decided in Edinburgh.
That would be decided in Edinburgh, but without oil revenues, again it goes back to that, we are only raising income taxes in Scotland. So at current, the Barnett formula funds Scotland and the rest of the UK, the other countries within the UK. Now at the moment this means that we get a higher proportion per head to spend than the rest of the UK. They're talking about doing away with that. In 2008 David Cameron said that the Barnett formula was definitely coming to the end of its life and would need to be replaced with something like a needs-based system.
Even Barnett agrees with that and has done since the year after he brought it in.
Yeah, correct.
It's just quite hard to find.
However, around 2 months ago, David Cameron said that Barnett would definitely continue post a novo. Which do you believe? 2008 David Cameron, or trying to keep Scotland on side David Cameron a couple of months back? Now, as I said, that Barnett said that himself, as it's unfair to, or seen as unfair by many in the UK to give Scotland more funding than its fair share. But if we're putting in more, then surely we should get a higher proportion back.
Not everyone,
and if we don't,
not everyone does agree that we actually put in more. Can we move on? Because quite a number of these issues are depending on forecasts, some of which, whether it is the taxation, because we know that the SNP are saying that they can actually reduce corporation tax, which is a very big offer. So we believe who we want to believe on that, same with oil revenues. Let's go for a moment, or it might be longer than a moment, to the subject of the currency. I had a brief discussion in a pub with someone that Neil knows on this subject, and I said, look, the currency is a totally fundamental issue. And he said to me, no problem with currency. He said, do you know Polynesian islanders use cowrie shells for currency? So I said, do you mean you're advocating we use cowrie shells? No, he's saying, I'm saying it's not an issue. It's a very, very major issue. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on it, but I know something about it. So if I can just briefly discuss it. If Scotland becomes a separate nation, it may have choices. It may not. If, for instance, we come out of the Union with England and become a member of the European community, which of course is another uncertainty. I think we know that the Spanish will vote against that and the Serbians will vote against it. So that is a job of persuasion by whichever Scottish government as well. But it is a part of the EU treaty that, I think it was Maastricht, it might have been Lisbon, or it might have been Schengen, that any new country into the European community must adopt the euro.
After a period within the exchange rate mechanism 2, which is a voluntary
Sorry, say that again?
The exchange rate mechanism 2, the mechanism by which you must join the euro,
yes,
is a voluntary mechanism. The precursor is a voluntary mechanism.
Yeah.
So no country can be forced to join the precursor, and therefore no country can be forced to join the euro when joining the European Union. Sweden, for example, is under obligation to use the euro, but they chose not to enter into the exchange rate mechanism 2, and therefore haven't adopted the euro.
Yeah, I mean, a number are not in it. Look, the UK is not in the euro.
Yeah.
But it's certainly been the view quite widely expressed by senior members of the EC that we would have to. So, I mean, let's...
Certain other members.
Yes, so first place, let's say we are forced to. The Eurozone has been a disaster. It's even a disaster for the rich countries like Germany. Very much a stagnating area of the world economy, and that was totally predictable from the creation of the Eurozone. It was indeed predicted in that when Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, who were the main drivers, brought this in, they agreed that there had to be a fiscal and budgetary union, and no one, for example, no country should have debt of more than 3% of GDP, for instance. And the first country that had debt of more than 3% of GDP was actually Germany, and the second one was France. And the whole thing fell apart. They are reaping the consequences of that. So going into the euro would be a problem. So we could opt, probably, assuming we are under no compulsion from the European community, we could opt to have our own currency, which we could call the pound. We could call it the pound sterling. We could call it the Big Eck or the Desperate Dan or anything we wanted to call it. And then how well it performs is a reflection of our economic performance, but even more, it's a reflection of the confidence that markets have in how well run this country is going to be. So let's say you are being paid in Desperate Dans, let's say, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that one of the poorer scenarios takes place, so your currency falls in value. That means that if you want to go abroad, for instance, it'll be extremely expensive for you to do that, because it will cost you a lot of the desperate damns to buy a dollar or a sterling or whatever. Now, if Scotland builds up credibility and good economic performance, then it can certainly take its place as a good currency. Alex Salmond is not helped by saying he might renege on the national debt with England. Whether that is a good negotiating point or not, this message that sends to markets is, this is a country that might renege on debts, why would we lend to them? And we will need people to lend to us, because every country does, even America, perhaps especially America. The last point in this, and then I fall silent, is we would like to have a currency union with England. And as George Osborne, Ed Miliband, Nick Clegg, etc. have said, England does not want to have a currency union with us for very, very good reasons. I think they would be mad to have a currency union with us.
Why?
Sorry?
Why?
Right, I'll come to that in a moment. And I've said it will not happen. And we said to Alex Salmond, what's your plan B? He says, you don't need a plan B because plan A is going to work. I said, but Alec, everyone that actually has the power to make it work is telling you it's not going to work.
Yeah, but I'll come back. Sorry.
Yes, by all means, I know that.
Come back to the quote
Sure,
I read earlier. It's hard to get somebody to understand something when there suddenly depends on them not understanding it. Now that is the case with all those MPs who have said it's not going to happen.
May I just sort of finish this point, and then I'll fall silent. England will be a foreign country, and I mean, we could use dollars. We could say to the United States, we want to be part of the dollar zone, as say Panama is, for instance. And the United States would probably say, yeah, fine, who cares? The important point is that if you are in a genuine currency union of this Eurozone type, then if the Scottish government is not particularly well run and runs up large debts, then in a currency union, the Bank of England, as it would be, would become liable for these debts. Why should it do that? What possible benefit could they have? Alex Salmond says they would do it because we do so much trade with them. We actually do, England, not the UK, actually does twice as much trade with the United States, 4 times as much with the European community. We manage that without England having the dollar or the euro. I'm falling silent.
Okay. So I go back to that quote. When it comes to a currency union, I'll start by saying many valid points. And if there was one issue that made me vote no, it would be the uncertainty around that.
I think it is the biggest single question.
Alex Salmond, though, when questioned, refuses to give a plan B or a plan C because he wants plan A. But there are other plans in the white paper. Plan B would be a pegged, use the pound as a free tradable currency.
And that won't create any problem for anyone. It's effectively the same as having your own. Well, it's not actually. No, it's actually a bad option. Because that is effectively what's happening to Greece, which is effectively pegged to the euro, which is really the Deutschmark, and it has been crucifying Greece, and Greece has survived remarkably well. But it's a very painful process. Really,
it's a painful process, but in terms of if you have very differing economies, then the risk comes in. With a pegged pound in Scotland, there would be less risk than that scenario that you've given due to the similarity in economies. So I believe that a pegged pound would work, although
it just may not happen.
Uncertainties, like you say, it's all about uncertainties. With the currency union option, I'm not an expert on it. don't claim to be.
I don't claim to be an expert either. I repeat what has been
but I would look at
explained to me.
Independent research when it comes to the currency union. So I've read part of the paper by Professor Leslie Young of Beijing School of Economics, I believe it was. September the 18th.com, I think it is. Tom Hunter, billionaire Tom Hunter.
The GDP sportsman.
He's commissioned his own, well, initially he was going to commission his own independent research into the whole process to make his own mind up, but he's released that now on September the 18th.com. I think that's the website. I'll double check at the end. Professor Leslie Young said that a currency union would be in the interest of all parties involved.
I'd be interested to know why.
And she's lit again. I wish I'd remembered the report right now. He has said that George Osborne's claims over the currency union are untenable and make no sense. That's an independent person.
So now we're going to have some questions from the audience. So, Anna, please.
Okay, so one of the issues that I think that hasn't really been discussed today is the issues of defence, and one in particular is the consensus seems to be that if Scotland was to become independent, that we would be getting rid of the nuclear submarines, nuclear weapons that are currently in Scotland, and of course that ties directly in with being a part of NATO. Is it a good policy to remain part of NATO and to get rid of the nuclear weapons, or what are your thoughts on what will happen if it's a yes or a no vote?
I think this is a very important question. I think the answer does partly depend, as I understand it, with whether Scottish independence would be followed by a government with the same attitude as the current Scottish National Party, which appears to be very hostile to nuclear weapons. I know that the people around the Holy Loch actually greatly regret the departure of the Americans, who used to be there in large numbers, because of economy and employment. It wasn't because of an attitude to nuclear weapons. NATO is a nuclear alliance. There's abundant evidence now that nuclear deterrent was all that prevented Russia, even as late as the Gorbachev era, from trying to occupy Western Europe. Scotland will no doubt be able to negotiate its situation with NATO, but if you go into a negotiation, you don't want to go into a negotiation as the weaker partner, and Scotland would be the weaker partner, not just negotiations with England, but with the NATO led by the United Nations. I think if we wanted to be part of NATO, which we'd be mad not to be, then I think the conditions imposed on us would be very stern indeed, and I think would have to include allowing nuclear weapons.
I think this very complex situation, as nukes haven't been used since World War II, who are we to say that they're needed at all? And as being part of NATO, we could help with other countries who are against nuclear weapons but part of NATO to bring about the denuclearization of the world. I think also that having nuclear deterrent could potentially make you a target if there was worldwide unrest. So rather than having them here on our shores and making Scotland the target, Scotland the fall guy for the rest of the UK, the one that will get the nukes used on it, I see no reason for taking them out. Take away the nuclear weapons, you take away the target. A lot has changed since World War II, since the Cold War era, and I believe that nuclear weapons aren't needed in the modern world. Diplomacy has advanced greatly, I believe, in certain areas within the Western world, and I don't think that nuclear weapons are needed. I don't think that people in the west of Scotland should have to live nearby the first target should nuclear war break out, Scotland would be the target.
I fully understand that point of view. I think you cannot uninvent nuclear power and nuclear weapons. I think whatever attitude we have in Scotland of 5.5 million people is not likely to weigh a great deal with Vladimir Putin or whatever the name of the Chinese leader is. I think it's always been the case that nuclear weapons would never be used. But, and this is what deterred the Soviet leaders, you can't be absolutely sure.
Because we can't be sure that that did deter them. Had the UK not had a nuclear deterrent and it was all on the US, well, would the US have come to the aid of the UK
yes.
had nuclear weapons been used? So was there any need for them for the UK in the first place? You've got your two world powers. I think anything in between that has...
We've really only got one world power now. I mean, the American economy is now 8 times the size of the Russian economy. Russia, unfortunately, still has a lot of weapons. We do rely tremendously on America to do everything. We possibly have to face the chance there would be an extreme right-wing Republican government that would be isolationist. But apart from that, I think the nuclear deterrent has been very effective. I think it's the only thing that prevented Third World War. And we should retain it. But in a sense, it doesn't matter what I think, and with great respect, in a sense, it doesn't matter what you think. It's really what America thinks, because they would be the main parties that Scotland would have to negotiate with about membership of NATO. And I think the Americans, for what I think are very understandable reasons, would drive a very hard bargain.
In terms of?
Saying if you want the protection of NATO, then I imagine they would say, you've got to keep these nuclear weapons.
Well, another thing to add to that is, as you rightly say, it depends on the government elected into Scotland in 2015. Personally, I don't see the need to be part of NATO. I think that the UN, without its nuclear weapons treaty, would step in if a peaceful country was invaded by another.
I mean, I think
democratically elected peaceful country.
I think the UN is a completely useless organisation, and I think that was demonstrated at the massacre of Srebrenica when the UN peacekeepers stood and watched the Serbs destroying the Bosnians, I think it was. The only effective peacekeeper in the world has been the Americans. They get blamed for it. They're told, oh, you bomb people. The reason they bomb people is usually because they're genocidal maniacs like Slobodan Milosevic or Saddam Hussein.
Peace in Iraq, sorry.
On the assumption that NATO is seen as something that should remain and NATO wants to stay nuclear, would it not be fair to ask the other members of NATO that are not hanging on to nuclear weapons, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Sweden, you name them, we are one of the only 2 countries in NATO that have the nuclear weapons. Is it then just France and us? But there are lots of countries within NATO that don't hold nuclear weapons. Why should Scotland be expected to hold if Scotland has voted against it? Would it not be fair and democratic then that the rest of NATO should be asked democratically to accept nuclear weapons in place of Scotland? There is, of course, the big question as to whether nuclear submarines are the way forward, and should the present generation be renewed. And if they're not the way forward, then Fastlane has no purpose in the future.
Attacked for it.
Right, thank you very much. I think we should move on to the next question. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
No one needs silence. It's democracy.
Right. The current Scottish policy regarding green energy is well known as wanting to become 80% reliable on renewables by 2020. Given Westminster's recent moves away from green energy, what would happen in Scotland and to its policy, do you think, if in the event of a no vote?
Well, the event of a no vote, personally, when it comes to energy policy is obviously another complex thing. Rather, might sound like a contradiction, but I believe that nuclear energy is the only semi-clean energy that we have at present, and that's not being renewed by Westminster at present either. So I think renewables, certainly to balance declining oil revenues, investing in a renewable rich country would be the way forward. So it worries me that to stay in the Union with a Westminster which is regressing away from green energy, which would mean that Scotland would have to use monies from other places. So potentially it goes back to, do we slash social welfare or increase taxes to pay for these in independent Scotland, which creates that negative taxation competition. So yeah, certainly it worries me, staying as part of Westminster, with Westminster controlling this. Most countries across Western Europe are making moves to become more renewable friendly, and I believe it's the way we should go, and only with independence can we achieve this 80% target.
There's a book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, written by Professor David Mackay of Cambridge University, who was an advisor to the UK government on this issue. And he goes through all of the possible sources of energy, except because, and it shows how new this is, except fracking. He doesn't discuss that at all. According to Professor Mackay, there are really only two viable ways of eliminating the use of fossil fuels. One is nuclear energy, and the other is to cover most of the Sahara Desert with solar panels and persuade the complete lunatics running the country there to allow us to channel that energy to the UK, etc. Now, he didn't break down the needs and supplies sufficiently to say what Scotland's situation would be. So obviously Scotland may well be able to provide more of its energy from renewables, but in a larger picture, certainly renewables don't take you very far. Particularly, they don't solve so far the major polluter, which is the motor car. I used to think it was airlines until I read Professor Mackay's book, The Motor Car, by a long way. And we have to be able to move to electric cars, for which the technology is quite feasible and has actually been done. But then you've got to produce the electricity to put the car get the cars to go. So I think Scotland should be using nuclear energy. It's clean. It is amazingly safe. I mean, even in Windscale, the oldest nuclear plant in Britain, the amount of energy radiated from the waste is only equivalent to what you get if you live in Cornwall or Aberdeen, where the rocks are radioactive. So that's my view on it.
Yeah. To answer that though, at present, we have to use the word at present. It may not be viable, and it may not be viable to run, electric cars because you've got to produce the energy. Renewables might not be the way. Without investment, you take away the potential. So, for example, the amount of medical advancements that we got out of what many saw as a useless gesturing space race. Many of our imaging techniques, just use as an example, that were developed for the space race are now used to help identify cancer. Without investing in the space race, something that was seen as potentially useless, we would never have had that discovery. So if you choose not to invest in renewables, somewhere potentially we could find a way of using green energy to power cars. But without the investment there's no potential. We take the potential for scientific advancement away. Fracking, however, is using fossil fuels, polluting groundwater. I can't see any way that the development of technologies for fracking will further any green cause or any...
I think it does. I mean, there are dangers, but I think they're well monitored in the United States, and the licensing process, I think, does take account of them very well. And in the United States, it's producing very non-polluting gas, because the gas doesn't actually pollute. It just produces carbon dioxide and heat, and you don't actually get any residue.
You have no pollution from gas?
There's no pollution from...
You don't consider carbon dioxide to be a pollutant or methane to be a pollutant?
Well, depends what happens to the carbon dioxide. When it's emitted from the fracking, as far as I understand it, it's combined quite quickly with water and flushed away.
To make carboxylic acid?
H2O plus CO2, so you get hydrogen, not carbonated, combined with another oxygen.
So carbonic acid, called carboxylic acid,
just decomposes. You're a biologist, aren't you?
Yeah. I think anyway. There's not too strong on my chemistry.
I am flawed on this. I know you're all surprised to hear it. There is a very informative, I was going to say good, but that's a matter of being, very informative website on this, again from Cambridge University, about fracking, its products, its dangers, the licensing, and the conclusions there, possibly by someone who has an axe to grind, because perhaps everybody has, that it is a very safe and clean form.
So a lot of what you've talked about, and it seems a lot of emphasis has been placed on the contribution of the oil and to the UK's economy, and therefore the Scottish economy. Many people seem to want to downplay the future of oil in that, as you were talking about earlier on, with the oil industries. given that although oil is a big part of Scotland's industry, one of the things you mentioned was whisky is a big contributor as well, but there's a lot of other softer industries, including academia, that appear to be much more stable than what you've talked about with the oil industry as being more volatile. What are your thoughts on this, if there was a yes or a no vote in terms of contributing towards the UK or the Scottish economies?
In a sense, I think this is almost the central question of the whole debate. If oil continues to be a highly valued commodity and can be used in ways that are consistent with green alternatives, then the future for an independent Scotland would look very bright. I would think the aim of any intelligent government, whether based in Westminster or Edinburgh, would be to continue to try to reduce dependence on oil. But it's not at all easy to do. One of the reasons that oil has survived as long as it has as a major fuel is it does a great many things far more efficiently than its competitors. There are certainly areas where oil is used which can be replaced, and Rory is quite right, research might produce more, but we've had the green industry being very active and well supported for quite a long time now. They're still not making a very big impact globally on world energy production. So I think it's a real issue which, with any luck, good politicians will be trying to address, but it's not an easy one.
Going back to renewables, staying in the UK means that renewables won't be invested in, and renewables could potentially play a large part of the Scottish economy. And again, it's about potential. Other key things like life sciences, academia. Scotland has shown that partially devolved areas of these, they've been very successful in investing and maintaining this level of contribution of these to the economy. I'd like to go back to renewables now, and the potential. It's easy to say that it doesn't, and for a long time now hasn't provided what we initially thought it might, because if you shut that down or fund it less, then you take away the potential. Scientific advancements are made all the time. In fact, for the last 200 years, science has improved the lives of all of us more than anyone of that time could imagine. So I think it's important to increase and maintain investment and government policy to make sure that life sciences, that renewables, that technology is invested in, to realise that potential and to keep the avenue open for discoveries that might, again, it's an unknown. All of these situations are unknown, but by staying in the UK, we give control over that potential to Westminster, who at the moment, it's a Conservative government. As the polls are going at the moment, it will be again, and they, out of any of the parties, have the least friendly policies when it comes to renewables, when it comes to life sciences, when it comes to the advancement of science. So I believe that being in Scotland would give the scientific community the potential to generate assets to the economy which will have no potential under the UK system.
I should declare an interest here that I hate windmills. I'd like to see them gone.
Again, that's another thing with potential. Windmills initially didn't produce very much energy, but new gearing ratios and systems have allowed their energy output to increase.
That's bad news to me.
That's bad news.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I think it's time to move on to the next question. Yeah.
Okay.
Given that all the sentiments about Scotland and independence, the word fair has come up so many times in the last 2 years. is it fair that if we say yes to independence, that England and Wales are left with a permanent Conservative government?
The answer to that is they won't be. Scotland, since World War II, there have only been 2 elections where the Scottish vote swung the Westminster government. So we wouldn't be condemning them to conservatism. In fact, I believe that independence would revitalise politics across the UK. I believe that people, certainly for me, this period of the last year or so has been very exciting to see people who did not care actually begin to give a damn. So we wouldn't. It is fair. It's democratic. It's a democratic process to elect the government that we want. What's not fair and undemocratic is that we are underrepresented. Is that we aren't represented generally by the governments that Scotland votes for. Yeah.
We had 13 years of a Labour government. I mean, I can't really object to that.
Well, no, but
I object to the people.
Like I say,
the
Scottish vote didn't swing that either way.
No, but
had Scotland voted entirely conservatively for that 13 years of Labour government,
but it
wouldn't
Scotland
have swung
was
the
voting
election.
Labour. We got a Labour government.
Yeah, but
so anything that happens south of the border is perfectly fair.
You're saying Scotland voted Labour, we got a Labour government. Turn it on its head, had Scotland voted Conservative, there still would have been a Labour government. The votes of Scotland didn't matter one bit, so is that fair?
Well, I mean, the only way that we could get around that is by having massive immigration every year so that we can... I mean, we're 5.5 million, they're 55, we're never going to swing a vote there.
No, so surely it's a better system to...
Well, I mean, it doesn't mean we don't get a government that we want.
Well, the fact that we have an additional member system rather than a first-past-the-post system in Scotland means that it's a more democratic election in the first place.
I mean, we can vote for our representatives in Holyrood already, and in the European Parliament, even a UKIP one in the European Parliament. We've probably dealt with that, have we?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So, next question, please. Done. That's all we've done. Right, so we can move on to your closing statements then. Okay, so who would like to go first?
Well, there clearly are a great many issues to consider about referendum and separation. I tend to refer to it as separation rather than independence because I actually think that a modern Scot has as much independence as any human being on the planet has ever had. And I don't think a separate government brings by itself any independence worth having. North Korea actually has a separate government, and I don't think that's done a lot for independence within the country. I return to my 2 questions that I would like to know what problem of Scotland has now could, on credible assumptions, be improved or solved by separation. And I do think, with my other question, what problems might we have? I think a great many. And going along with that, there is the benefit of my being extremely old, in that Britain has progressed out of all recognition and faster than other European countries under the Union. And this is not for the first time. After the Union of 1707, Scotland moved from being a poor country on the edge of Europe to being not just a very important commercial centre, but being the intellectual leader of the Western world. I would never have said that before reading a wonderful book called The Scotch Enlightenment by an American, Arthur Herman. The Union opened all sorts of doors for Scotland, and that went on. Scotland and Britain were very, very badly damaged by 2 dreadful world wars. The recovery has been terrific, and I would not want that to be risked. It's a union that I think works extremely well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we speak about this union. It was formed in 1707 against the wishes of the Scottish people. Yeah, it could have brought many benefits. Who's to say those benefits wouldn't have come anyway? Like I say, it's all supposition and uncertainty. Now, none of us can say that an independent Scotland will be great. Likewise, no one can say or claim that an independent Scotland would go down the pan. You used the example of North Korea.
I admit that was mischievous.
Yeah, that was very mischievous. There have been many. You look at the history of the entire world. Empires rise and empires fall. And as those empires fall, small countries break off and have fiscal as well as social autonomy. They can decide the movement that they want to go. The British Empire has been falling for the past 100 years. In the last century, more countries became independent from the British Empire than in the previous century. Scotland, I feel, is at that crucial moment where it makes the decision: do we take matters into our own hands, or do we stay in a part of a union where policies and legislation does not meet what you or I want? You know, the naysayers will say, well, we don't all want the same thing anyway. This is true, and that is the crux of democracy. Only by using a proportional representation system, by having a small government accountable to its people, can you really get the wishes of the people enacted within that country. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I believe that Scotland will all be richer under independence straight away, that we'll all be more prosperous, we'll all have brilliant jobs and nice cars. That's rubbish. Day one of independence, my guess would be things aren't very different. And that would maintain for the following few years. Yes, there most likely will be a difficult phase as investors and big business decide what to do about Scotland. But that will also create opportunities for entrepreneurialism, for advancement of science, for academics to choose what areas they want to focus on. At present, these are all things that are hampered in some way by Westminster government. I believe that Holyrood would be a fairer system, just purely in terms of the democratically elected process. And I want to be part of a small country where I have genuine influence, which I don't have at the moment, that democratically elects its government and chooses the direction it wants to go in, rather than being guided by a rather larger country which focuses its needs on London and the South East. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your contribution to this debate that, will probably take us to the September the 18th. Hopefully going to benefit some people to make their decision what they're going to vote or not. And, well, good luck to anyone who wins, and then history will show. Okay, thank you very much again. Thank you.